There were a few complaints for a virtual session I did that there wasn't enough sex in the book. Case of false advertising. I make no apologies. Listen, I don't know how much you know about this book, but I got intrigued by it because there was an article by an English writer called John de Saint-Jean, and he wrote in the New Yorker a very long, intriguing essay about called The Unmasking of O. Now, even by today's standards, Story of O is a scandalous novel. It was a scandal back then. It would be a scandal all over again, I suspect. But no one knew who the author was. It was all very hush-hush. The people inside the literary circles in Paris knew who the author was. So that was a woman called Dominique Aury. But nobody outside of the literary circles did know, and it says a lot for that tight literary circle in Paris that none of them fessed up. None of them actually dobbed her in. They were tight. They were quiet, and it wasn't until she actually announced herself in 1994, I think it was. And we can go into all the reasons why she chose anonymity. Dominique Aury, a truly sophisticated intelligence, an utterly formidable woman. She was fluent in English. She translated the greats of the day for Gallimard, Eliot, she translated, Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, the whole lot. A truly formidable intelligence. She intimidated most people around her. I actually got to interview a person called Philippe Soleuse, who's one of the most acclaimed living novelists in France. Inside Gallimard, it gave me entree into the place. And I said to him, you know, what was she like, you know? And he said, oh, she scared me.
Now, I know you're driven to write about history and literature and writers themselves and the cultural production of books and how books are made from other books. But of all the writers and all of the books you have chosen to exercise your novelist's intrigue, why this one?
Well, as I say, I came to read it because of the New Yorker article, and also because I was about to embark on my third novel. There are two reasons, I think. My third novel is called The Love Song of Lucy McBride. And I knew there were going to be erotic scenes in it. And they are incredibly hard to write. You know, it's no wonder there are competitions around the world for bad sex writing, because it's so easy to do, you know, with all the best of intentions. You just, you know, one false step and you're into cliche, or you're into mere functionality. You know, it's very, very difficult. So I was told to go and read Anais Nin, which I duly did. But right next to Anais Nin...
Usually, I think usually it's a bit...
Usually, yes. Right next to Anais Nin was Story of O. Now, I'd heard about it, and I knew it was notorious, but I didn't know much more about it. And I eventually got around to reading it, and when I read it, it wasn't all the dirty doings in the chateau that actually struck me. It was two things. It was the constant repetition of key words. Now, you've got to remember that Story of O was conceived of and written in the direct rain shadow of the most shameful phase in modern French history. That is the German occupation of France. It was written 4 years after, conceived of 4 years after. So it's in a direct rain shadow of it. And when I was reading it, the key words that kept coming back, I've actually written down, there's so many of them: surrender, defeat, submission, humiliation, shame, masters, foreign force, the odd occupation, but it didn't really need to be mentioned. And it struck me that those key words, and it's only a novella, It's about 45,000 words, I think. But those key words returned again and again and again. Something like about 150 times. I circled them all in the book. And I started thinking, I've got a funny feeling this book could be working on a level that the author never conceived of. And then I started thinking about the plot. Now, what happens in Story of O, in essence, is that a woman only known as O willingly consents to prostitute herself to please her boyfriend. And that also struck me as being almost a kind of mirror image of what took place in France in May 1940, when Marshal Pétain willingly surrendered his country and handed it over to the Germans, pretty much without a fight. It was because the government was so divided. It was astonishingly just mad. It was the worst government at the worst possible time. Apparently, after the invasion, they found 1,000 Peugeot tanks just outside of Narbonne in the south of France. Now, 1,000 Peugeot tanks would have repulsed the German advance, but they were down south. Nobody even thought to move them when the Germans came through the Ardennes forest. It was an extraordinary situation and a very common depiction of France by the French in literature and in visual arts in the 1940s by resistance figures was of the whore that rolled over all too easily. Now, I'm not endorsing the language. I'm simply saying that was the language of the time. And so the idea of Pétain as being the pimp, handing over his country to be basically turned into a brothel, because what the Germans did is they turned France into an R&R centre, and France became basically an R&R centre, brothel, entertainment area. And so the two came together, the plot and the key words. And I thought, my God, is this novel an unconscious metaphor for the thing that the country desperately wants to forget? That is the occupation. O for occupation. And it's one of those situations whereby the individual psyche of the author is like that of the whole country writ large. And what she has done, I'm arguing she has no idea that these are the resonances of the book. This is a reading of the book. And to me, it's, if I'm allowed to use the D word, to me, it's a deconstructive reading of Story of O, but in fiction form, not an essay. And by a deconstructive reading, I mean that there is always something that haunts a novel, the thing that the novel doesn't want to know about or doesn't know about. And I can give lots of other examples, but a novel, when it presents itself. It is a present thing. This is the story. These are the characters. This is what's going on. But a deconstructive reading will always maintain that there is an absent present. And in the thing that haunts the book. And it's usually found in the footnotes or in the margins or wherever. I found it in the keywords. I claim I do, in the keywords and in the plot line itself. That absent present was, in fact, the occupation. And that's the ghost that haunts what presents itself as an erotic fairy tale. An author must know, I think, what he or she thinks, or what they think, when they're writing a book. I mean, I would have spent about a year working out how I'm going to approach this and how to do it. Like with the T.S. Eliot novels. Those novels take about 2 months to write. The Glenroy novels drained me completely because they all took about 2 years to write. And there was no sense of mythology of the suburbs. You know, The Suburbs are either laughed at or just TV sitcom. Those Glen Roy novels were just, it took 20 years to write. I was drained. I was tired after every single one, and I knew the strength that had gone out of me would never come back. It just took that much because there was no mythology. It had, kind of like you felt you had to create the mythology of the suburbs from the ground up and create a style which came from all over the place, very European. In its origins, and so when I say the author isn't in control completely, it's true to a degree. You've got to know what you need to know to write the book. Otherwise, the big danger is you're just going to waffle, and anything's better than bullshit and waffle. You've got to really have a clear idea what you want to say. Now, when it hits the deck in the public domain, then it becomes something else altogether. And when people read it, they make it their own. And they may very well come up with things that you've never thought of. Because you've got to face it. A lot of fiction and writing is drawn from the unconscious. And the unconscious is so often so far ahead of the conscious in writing fiction. Sometimes I'll write something and I think, oh God, you know, well, what have I done that for? And I realised that somewhere along the line, I'd actually had been thinking of it, and that the unconscious was waiting at the bus stop for me when the bus came in, saying, what took you so long? So there is that aspect to writing, that we don't control the unconscious, and we don't control society, we don't control history, and there's that whole thread going through this book, because it enabled me to go into a whole lot of theoretical issues that I couldn't have done in other books. And there is that whole notion in this, that to what extent is the author gifted and imaginative, or, you know, imaginative as they may be, you know, I'm thinking of famous authors, but to what extent is an author the conduit through which the times themselves write themselves? That to what extent do the times actually work through the author themselves? Because we are born into a time, we are born into a culture, we are born into a language in a certain incarnation at that time. We're born into so much that we don't control, but nonetheless infuse our being and make us what we are. So there's all this stuff we can't write, and so we can't control. And so intention, it's up for grabs.